Creating beautiful assets for ever bigger games within performance is really difficult. So we as artists need to look for more creative ways on how to create the work that we love while being smarter when doing so. That is why today we are joined by Hugh Chew, Senior Material Artist at PlayStation Studios Visual Arts. With close to a decade of experience working on games such as Concord, The Last of Us Part 1, Asgard's Wrath 2, and others, while also being a part-time teacher. So this creates like a perfect blend between a highly skilled artist, but also someone who really knows how to explain techniques to other people as well. And that is exactly what makes this lesson on material layering in Unreal Engine 5 so valuable. So please join me in welcoming Hugh Chew for our latest workshop.
For today, the agenda essentially is going to be, we're going to discuss what material layering is and how it differs from your standard texture authoring, or in other terms, legacy authoring workflow that we're typically used to in game productions. The example I'll be using is the Colt Cobra personal project of mine. And what we're going to do is we're going to go over what material layering is. We're going to compare and contrast the workflows. We're going to go over some examples inside of game productions of like who has actually used material layering, so you also can take a look either. We'll also go through a kind of simple walkthrough of my Unreal Engine project, as well as go over what you would need to do to set up to make sure that everything's all prepared to use material layering for your assets. And then finally, we'll have a Q&A. So yeah, here's some examples of my Colt scene. So if you guys want to take further information on it, you can definitely find it on my ArtStation. I did a kind of brief breakdown of it to kind of show how I set up the entire thing, but we'll go a little bit more in depth later on in the workshop. Now, in this example I have right here is kind of like what we typically are used to with the standard texturing workflow. You know, typically for weapons, you would do your low poly bake, high poly bake, and you would just do everything inside of Substance Painter. That's how we typically do the texturing, which here I have a kind of little workflow of how this pipeline typically goes. So yes, we do modeling UVing and do a high poly to low poly bake. And then we do our texturing inside of whatever DCC that we're using, whether it's Substance Painter, Marmoset Toolbag, or Quixel, using tileable materials that we typically would make. And then, of course, once we get those textures made and everything's all baked out, we then import that into whatever game engine that we're using. Now, we do have one issue. Sorry, I apologize why these slides are going to be jumping around everywhere, but let's see what's going on. So, one issue that we typically have when it comes to the standard texturing workflow is that when we look at our assets, whether it's props, environments, or weapons in this case, there's typically going to be two limitations that we have when it comes to these types of assets. One is that they typically require extra textures or detailed textures to be overlaid on top of whatever we're working in. Typically, you probably want to have like a nice close-up of whatever asset that you're working in. And because that we pre-bake our textures and export them out into our game engine, we don't have that nice close-up detail because we have to lower down our resolutions. We can't, always have a 4K texture resolution for every asset that we're working in. But because of that, we have to add extra textures on top to help accentuate the quality of what these assets are. The second thing is we have very limited ways of changing what our assets look like after they get into the game. We can either do things like simple color tinting, or we can do like little instances of adjusting the roughness, or even just like adjusting the intensity of the normal map, but there isn't really that much else after. And the reason why I bring up all this stuff and why I'm using the kind of standard texturing workflow is because we are now in the 9th generation of games. In this example, we have The Last of Us, which was originally a 7th generation game on the PS3. And we now have a 9th generation version of it with The Last of Us Part 1. The reason why I'm showing this is because most game productions we've ever used with these texturing programs have been from very old legacy things, such as, from the 6th, 7th, 8th generations, doing things like normal maps. Again, we need to start thinking about how we can change this, because as we start to go through this, we're starting to notice new changes with the 9th generation. Issues like longer productions and development times. We've gone from being able to ship out a game within, 2 to 3 years to now almost 10 years now. So it's something that's one big issue. Another is, of course, the change of, instead of having much smaller, easier to use levels, we now have more larger open concept levels. We have very, very large environments that we have to deal with. The other things are, of course, more robust and complex shaders that take up more performance to make sure that we get the nice quality bar that we're trying to achieve. Other things like fidelity. In this case, fidelity just means things like having more polygons so things don't look as low poly, having more things that are actually like changing or messing around with. Basically, the big issue we've been having is just performance. By dealing with all these issues and all these little fires, essentially, they've essentially either made or broken productions in games. We've seen essentially a plateau where we've gone to the point of having very high quality and very high fidelity games, but we've just run into an issue where we're still having a hard time trying to make sure that it runs on a console or platform efficiently. So what do we need to do? We have, of course, our simple implementations, things like LODs, MIP mapping. Of course, there's the level loading way, which is like when you go through a game, you're crawling through a crack essentially in between stuff in the games. But there's also things like textile density and channel packing, things that we can try and be a little bit more efficient with stuff. Working with Unreal Engine 5, we have some more very specific ones like Lumen, Nanite, virtual textures, and of course AI upsampling with their temporal super resolution. They also help to make sure that we can have a very efficient looking game. But again, our quality bar has changed. We're never making just one version of the game anymore. We have to make practically two in most cases. We have a performance mode, which usually runs at about 1080p at 60 FPS, or we have a quality mode that's at 4K at 30 FPS. They also want things like no load screens, full HDR, real-time shadows and real-time reflections, full PBR materials, and of course, larger poly counts overall. So the quality bar has very much changed to when we have learned in how to work with these like standard workflows for texturing. And you can see here from this example, Black Myth Wukong, a 9th generation game inside of Unreal Engine, we're dealing with these very sparse loading issues with these textures. Now, we don't know for certain what it could be. It could be a simple MIP mapping issue, or it could be the fact that maybe there's a textile density issue. We don't know, but these performance issues are being very noticeable to the gamers that are playing these games. And we don't want the gamers to see these issues because, of course, they're going to, give us flack, and we don't want that. So our new way is using layered materials workflow. Here's an example of what it looks like inside of Unreal Engine with the new layered material UI that we have on the side here. Now, the difference between the standard texturing workflow and a layered material workflow is, of course, we have our standard, model in UV, but we don't necessarily need to bake. We can actually just leave it at mid poly. So you can just literally make whatever you're working on, model it to make sure that it actually has a nice, efficient silhouette. And then, of course, you can bake it if you want to, or you can import that directly into Unreal Engine. And then from there, we texture directly inside of Unreal Engine, cutting out the need for a Substance Painter or Quixel or anything like that. Here is an example video of what layered materials look like inside of Unreal Engine. So here with my Colt, I have a untextured asset. On the side, I have essentially a layer stack. This layer stack is very similar to, programs like Photoshop or Substance Painter. Now, as I start, I go through and I start to, bring in the assets. I have, of course, my, background layer, which is my first layer. In this toggleable wood that I have here, I can toggle on different parameters just like inside of a material instance. If you guys are familiar with the master material and instance workflow inside of Unreal. Here, I can turn on things like wear and tear that I actually have generated masks for. So you can either have a nice clean version of the wood, or you can toggle the wear and tear. You can change the color of the wear and tear, the intensity, all these different things. then of course the next thing is we can just turn on another layer and have this tileable metal texture masked out, or bullets or bullet casings. All these different types of assets are being blended on top. And then the last one that you see right here that's being turned on is a macro blend, or essentially a blend of a baked normal map and ambient occlusion map on top, just to add a little bit of accentuation. But for the most part, we're doing all of our masking and all of our texturing with tileables directly inside of Unreal Engine without the need for another texturing program. It makes it so much easier to do our customization and workflows here versus the other way. So here's kind of a little breakdown of technicality. So work with me here. We're going to be talking a little bit about numbers. So for a standard export of our gun that we have right here. Now, this is only one typical weapon slot, but of course, some weapons or some assets might have multiple sub materials. So this number might actually multiply further than what we're dealing with. But say we export out 4 standard texture maps, an ambient occlusion, a normal map, ORM, which is our channel pack map of our roughness, metallic, and ambient occlusion, and of course our height map. So that's 4 textures. If you export all 4 of them out at a 1K resolution, you have about 10 megabytes, which is not too bad. If you have the availability to, you can bump it up to a 2K. That could be 40 megabytes. 4K, which some places do, you would bump up to 160 megabytes. So think about just this one asset's textures alone taking up 1/10 of a gigabyte. We don't want to have to deal with very large disk installs. So we try to make sure that we keep this at a much lower number. We want to make sure everything uses very smaller, more efficient textures, because you're probably like me. You probably don't want to have to download a game that's like 200 gigabytes. It's too much to have to deal with. So overall, if we keep to a 1K to 2K resolution, we're probably looking with 10 to 40 megabytes, also depending on if we need detailed texture maps to help accentuate smaller close-up details for things like the metal or the gun handle. Now, for the layered material example, we have 2 tileable materials, a tileable varnished wood material and a tileable metal. Each one of them are exported out at a 1K texture resolution, but because of how I've set things up, I could actually lower it down to a 512. I didn't have to, but I wanted to just give it a little bit more quality because I had the bandwidth for it. Now, each one of those textures, each one of those tileable materials has 3 textures: albedo, normal, and ORM. So given that we have 3 textures per material, that's about 3 megabytes per material, or 6 megabytes overall with just the 2 texture sets that we're working with. There's also 3 baked maps that I have applied here. An ID map, which is essentially a map that color picks where I can choose the materials to be placed on the mesh. A normal map, because I can overlay the normal map on top of my mesh. And then the last one is a channel pack of 3 different masks that I can generate from inside of Substance Painter. So here I have the wood, the metal, and then of course, like all the scratches and damage and dirt accumulation, that's all from those channel pack maps, essentially. So with 2 texture sets plus 3 1K maps, we're looking at about 14 megabytes, give or take. So it doesn't seem like it's made too much of a big change, but the fact is that with a layered material workflow, those same tileable textures can be used on other things and not just on the weapon. You can use it on tables, windows, architecture, anything essentially. You can use the same metal that you're using to use for every single metal inside of the game. So the reason why we try to push for a layered workflow is because it's versatile. It allows us to use assets that are already inside the game that we're already using for other means to help texture. Whereas if you did the standard legacy texturing workflow, you wouldn't be able to use those weapon textures on anything because they're very specific and bespoke to that weapon mesh. Now, there are also other things that I could have done to make the weapon that I had worked on a little bit more efficient. Things like I could replace the ID map that I have with vertex paint. That's one way I can help make it a little bit more efficient. I could also get rid of the need for a macro normal map, the baked normal map that I have to overlay on top, by just changing it to being more of a mid-poly asset. So if I modeled it more, I wouldn't need that normal map in the end. But again, these are different things that you can change. No matter what, it's still a more efficient workflow, even with this version. Now, for you probably wondering what games are actually even using this workflow, we actually have a couple. And this is just a very small list. There's others that, if you look further into the weeds, there are a lot. Of course, Epic is, working on this inside of their own game engine, so they have to test this stuff out. So they use it for games like Paragon, RIP, and Fortnite. They make sure that these workflows are very useful because they have to generate so many assets very, very quickly. They don't have a time to be able to make very unique assets as much. Now, Naughty Dog with The Last of Us has also used a layered material workflow. They use it because they have to be as efficient as possible to get these games to run especially well, because they have so much foliage, which is a huge bottleneck for a lot of game productions. And of course, Firewalk Studios with Concord, RIP. They also use layered material workflows for their environments as well as their characters. But there are also many, many other games and productions that are currently using this workflow or have used this workflow before. So now let's go into the actual demo for our material layering. So first, I have Maya open. And here is my cult asset that I'm working with. Now, the setup could be different for whichever means you're trying to go with. But in this case, the one thing you want to make sure you set up are things like, UVs and stuff. So with my gun, I have them set up into little small pieces because I want it all to be animated too if I wanted to. Like if I need to, I can go in here and grab the lever or grab the barrel and be able to have it move independently from where it's supposed to be. That's one of the cool things I like about this workflow, is that it doesn't have to be as crazy complex. But for the most part, when we are inside of the UV editor, there are typically two workflows that you might see when it comes to this, because I'm using, of course, a baked map as well as a tileable workflow. Now, the baked UVs, like you have all been trained, is they have to be not overlapping. They have to be all inside of a single UV grid without having any overlap, because you don't want them to bake on top of each other, which that's understandable. But the second thing is making sure that the tilables that we're working in are brought in at the proper size. Now, I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with the term textile density before, but essentially textile density is our way of taking a texture's resolution and applying it to a real world measurement. So say if we have a 512 texture, we probably want it to be 1 meter's length of data. So in this case, this gun is actually a lot smaller than 1 meter. So even just with having my texture, all my UV islands inside of a single grid like this, if I go in here inside of Maya, they have on the side of the UV toolkit a textile density checker. So if you go in here, there are a couple useful things. You can apply what size of map that you're using. And of course, there's a number here where you can actually apply a unit of measurement. So say if we have a 512 texture and a 1 meter bit of data, we have to bring it down to a very simple unit. So in this case, my units are in centimeters. So we have to divide 512 by 100 because, 1 centimeter is 1/100th of a meter. So it's 5.12 pixels per unit. That's how essentially our size is being worked on. So if this number is above it, then that's fine, because that means that we've already hit our number. But if it's below that number, that's where the problem is. So if I choose to set this at 5.12 and hit set, it will grab my little UV shell that's right here, and it will shrink it down because it's now smaller. But that is the proper textile density size that the front of this barrel needs. But of course, in this case, we've already hit that number. If I hit get, I'm already at 13.43. So bigger numbers are always better if you are working it with a much lower textile density. So it's fine. But say if you work on an asset that's not a gun, maybe a prop or an environment piece or something. If you have to still bake a normal map, AO map, or whatever, you're gonna have to use a UV set for just that. But then for the textile density parts for your tilables, you'd have to have a secondary UV set. So like in this example, I have these little triggers that I have here. If I go here, I have one UV set here set for one of them. And then I have a second UV set for that 512 texel density. The first one again is for the bake of the normal and AO. The second is for the tilables. So this will allow you to make sure that your textures, when they're brought in, are set to the proper size and resolution that they need to be per our performance limitations that we have. Now, of course, once you're ready, you can export out your gun into whatever DCC that you're working in, because the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to go over how to set up our maps inside of Substance Painter. So apologies, we're going to jump in here and give it a quick second to load. And I'm all doing this because, again, when you work on this stuff, you want to set up everything first before you bring it into Unreal Engine. Always make sure your test prep is already done before you bring it into whatever you're going to do your final renders with. So now let's open up my Colt. Give it a quick second. Might sound like a robot for a quick second because, of course, Painter has like the worst performance. Let me bump this guy down. So inside of our project that we have right here, I have, of course, my Colt weapon. And if I start to cycle through some of the textures, I actually have a couple special textures already made. I have things like, of course, my metallic, roughness, the standard PPR. And I also have things like an ID map. So this ID map essentially is going to be using the standard colors of red, green, blue, and alpha channel so that you can mask out things like, here's where the wood will be, here's where the main metal, and then of course here's where the bullets are, and then the central bullet casings will be, because each one of them is a different type of metal that's to be applied. And then of course I have other maps for my masks, but as right now I just have it nice and clean. Now, for you guys, you're probably wondering, how do I have these custom textures that I can actually use to author inside of Substance Painter? Well, if we go into our texture set and we go all the way to our channels, essentially the texture inputs that we're working with, we have, of course, our standard base color, height, roughness, metallic, normal, and AO. And then I have these other ones: ID, mask alpha, mask, curvature, cavity, ID maps. These are my ways of handling this. But if you want to bring in your own custom input that you can then use to generate your own mask, whether it's a color mask or whether it's a mask for wear and tear or dirt, if you go to the plus, this is where you can add in a texture. Now, the ones you see up here are all the textures that actually work with the shader that's being rendered inside of Substance Painter. But if we go just a couple steps further, there's these user channels. Now, these user channels are labeled 0 through 15. And when you bring one in, like say this user 6, you can double click on its name and give it a input name, call it test. The one thing you need to adjust after is this right here. So this is essentially like your color space information, whether it's color or grayscale. Go in here, you can choose if it's a standard like color map or if it's like a grayscale. L just means linear, but it's technically for a single grayscale color channel versus RGB, which is full red, green, blue color. So if you have all this stuff, say if we're just doing a simple grayscale map, I would just plug it into L8. So it knows that just one grayscale color channel. We can bring this in, and then I can use this for anything. If I want to generate a mask for it. So if I go in here and I add in a fill layer like we're typically used to, all I need to do is go down here, and of course I need to turn off all my other maps except for the one that I just generated, this test one. And as you can see, it's a grayscale value, so I can use this. So if I go in here and I set up a black mask to kind of mask out where everything is, I'll probably also need to make a base layer so that it knows that my test map is black. Again, this is for everyone. If you're using masks and stuff, you want to make sure that you have like a base layer that says, hey, give me a base PBR, base material input, but then also turn off all my masks because you don't want it to by default to have these masks turn on. So if I set this to black, we're good to start. But then for this guy, I have to turn all these ones off. Yes, and now you can see now it's black. So there's no mask. So if I go in here, I have this guy set to white. And if I just grab a generator, so let's add in a generator and I'll choose like metal edge. You can see now I have this like edge mask that I can use essentially. So when we're ready to export, say I have this one mask for my, say this is like my actual edge damage. I can make another one for dirt accumulation, or I can have another one for just other bits of damage or discoloration, essentially. When I'm ready to export, we go in here, we go to our little output templates. Typically, we don't have that texture on here. We have, our typical red, green, blue, alpha. Like we have our typical like RGB textures and stuff, but we don't have that input one yet. So if we go into, say I'll grab my macro one. So if I go in here and I'll just add a grayscale. Now, you typically want to give it a one of these, which is the way of setting the name of what the export is. So in this case, the little $ texture set just gives it the name of this right here. So whatever this is named, we'll give it that texture. And then you do an underscore and give it a whatever suffix you want to add. So I can just call this one test. So what you need to do now is go down and you need to find that number that we just generated with essentially for our mask. So in this case, we have user 6. So if I drag him in, set him to grayscale, and that's it. Now, when you do this, always make sure whatever map that you set, whether it's wear, damage, discoloration, a mask ID, or whatever, it stays that number. You cannot just give it any sort of random number on export because it's going to try and use whatever inputs there. So if you already have it as user 6, don't use user 7 or 8 or 9. Like make sure user 6 is the one that you use for that. So once you have it ready, you can export that out and you are basically good to go. So now we just close this out and let's open up Unreal Engine. So here we have my Colt's weapon. It's already textured, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through how to set up the material layering and of course, how to set up the tileables and blends for our scene. So if we go in here, the first thing we need to do is we need to set a master material or like a material template to then create an instance for our weapon. In this case, I'll go in here. I'll call this one MM for master material. That's typically the prefix that I work with. And then I'll call it environment base layer. Again, it's really user's choice, so you can give it whatever name you want, but this is what I'm going to use for my master material for material layering. So if I go in here, and here is my material editor, we have what we're typically used to. We have the graph, we have the material export node, and we have all our settings. But in this case, we need to change it so that it uses a different type of workflow. Because right now, what this does is it sets it up so that I can use textures to do my blending and stuff. But in this workflow, we're not blending textures, we're blending materials. We're essentially moving past the need for those little smaller building blocks. We need to actually blend materials overall. So what we need to do is we need to grab this guy and change it to use material attributes, thus essentially shrinking this guy down. So essentially, this is what we have so far. Now, if you type in like material attributes, you'll get a bunch of different types of nodes. So we have things like how to blend them, how to break them, which essentially goes from making a material and then breaking it back down to its original texture components. And then, of course, you can get and set values. The one we want is a material attributes layer. Because what this does is it generates our first layer, which is the background. If you guys are familiar with Photoshop, you'll know that when you first open up an image, there's always a background layer as like your first layer. This is what this will do essentially. So let's first start off with this, and then we'll do a get material attributes. So it knows to grab the textures that come from this layer, and then we're gonna set them. So by getting and setting, it knows to grab, set, and then render. So let's hit save. And that's all you need for now. Next, we need to make an instance of this. So call this mi, and I'll make it for my Colt. So if you go in here and you open up your instance, you'll see that we have our typical information that we're used to with the UI. But if you've seen this before, you'll see this layer parameter information. And you'll see we actually have a layer right here, this background layer. Now, this background layer is actually missing something. And it's a new type of material asset that you guys are probably not familiar with. So let's go and actually create it. So in each layer that we're going to be needing, we need to actually have an asset that defines what material we have. And then we later on need to have an asset that blends those materials together. So if we go in here, we go down to material, and we go down to layers, we need a material layer asset. Call this one ML underscore. And think of this almost like a mini version of the master material. So like when we are giving this a name, think of it almost like as an archetype. So I'll call this my like environment base. So it's an environment based asset. There's nothing special or needed to be rendered. There's no proper shading model or anything like that. So we just have it just like this. And then of course we open them up and we have this. Now, what we need is we need to actually be able to set textures in here, because we already have a set. We already have an output, which this, it's blue right now, but it's the same material output as here. It's just giving a preview on here. So what we need to do is let's search up those attribute nodes, and we need a make material attribute. What this does is it acts just like the typical material output, but it's going to convert it down to a single wire, a single input value, because we're now converting from using texture inputs, like I had mentioned before, to materials that are going to be blending together, not textures blending. So we're going to plug this guy in, and now we need to start to bring in our textures. Now, in this case, I have a couple textures already set up. I have these. These are my base textures. So because this guy is going to be created with parameters, because of course we still want to have customization. And you guys probably have worked with material instances before, and especially when you use texture parameters, you probably might not be aware, but when you are essentially working with parameters, it uses whatever you leave in it as default. So say as an example, if you have a texture that's 4K, 2K, or whatever the resolution is, and you bring it in and you don't use it, it still uses that 2K texture. So it's probably better not to use 4K textures as your default texture when you're making a master material and then creating an instance from it. So I have these guys, which are just simple base like color textures that are at a very low resolution, which of course we can lower it to something much smaller, like a 1020, like a 128, or even like a 64 or 4x4. That's another one you can do. So what we can do now is we'll go in here and we'll drag all these guys in, and I can use them for, again, whatever I need. So we have our base albedo. We have our normal map. We have our channel pack, which again is AO in the first slot, roughness in the second slot, and then metallic in the third slot. And then, actually, sorry, I grabbed the wrong one. That's my mask texture. So let me grab this. Grab this and grab this. And then of course we have other textures that we can use, like our height map. But in this case, we probably don't need it, so I'll just delete it. And then we have like a masking type of component texture that we can use. But right now we don't have that functionality set up yet. So for now, let's go in here and let's set up some basic parameters. So let's select all these guys, right click, convert them to parameter. and we'll start to set up everything. So albedo, normal, and ORM. Now, we also want to make sure that we set up things efficiently. We want to make sure that if there is parameters, that we make sure that it's all nice and organized, because if you work in a team, you want to make sure that it's set not just for you, but for your teammates as well. So if we go in here, let's group these guys up into a textures group. So if you guys aren't familiar, basically you can organize these guys into their own little sections. So this little drop down will create a group priority for them. So if I go down now, I can put them in a textures group like so. And of course, for this guy, again, I'm not sure with what you guys have to deal with in your experience, but if you guys have ever opened up a project that's not yours originally, you might have an issue where basically you don't know what the channel pack texture actually does. And because there's no labels on it, you're like, okay, what does this actually do? So what you can do here in a parameter for a channel pack texture, you can actually give the channels their own actual name. So if I go in here, I can give the name for the red channel to be my AO texture, my green channel, my roughness, and my metallic. And as you can see right here, they all show up as actual inputs. You can actually see how their names are labeled. So let's hit save and start off with this. So now if we go in here, I have my material layer for my environment base I have right here. So if I grab him, and again, just like how it is with the material instance, if you click on these little arrows, you'll see I have a little texture group for my parameters. Now I can set my first texture up. So first, let me just hit save real quickly. And let me actually change to this instance. So let's go in here. Call this Colt. So now we have our first asset essentially applied. So now let's go in here and change the textures. So let's grab my wood texture. We have our albedo. We have our normal map. And we have our ORM texture. And as you can see, they're all applied, though there are probably some things that I need to adjust on them, little things that might need to be tweaked. So we can go back in here and start to add some more parameters. So let's start off with some tiling. So you hold you bring in a texture coordinate node. This allows you to actually be able to control the tiling on it. So let's grab this, and I'll grab in a value that I can use for tiling. Plug them in. And we probably need to also apply a way to rotate it. So if I type in, there's a node that I like to use called custom rotator. And what custom rotator does is it actually allows you to rotate the texture based off of just a little bit of information. So we can use things like, let me grab a vector 2, because it needs to know where is the center of our where we're rotating it, which in this case, it's not like the pivot point of our mesh. It's actually asking where on the texture do we rotate it. So the middle of the texture is 0.5 and 0.5, because again, we start from a 0 to 1 type of grid. So 0, 0 being like the bottom left corner, and then 1, 1 being the top right. So by having it at 0.5 and 0.5, it's right in the middle of our little grid. So we plug that in, and now we have ourselves a rotation. So we'll type in UV rotation angle. And now if I hold shift, I can grab all these guys and plug them in. And let's hit save. And now, as you can see, if I go back to my Colt, I'm going to just show just this side right here. You see I have a couple little parameters that we can change now. So I can, of course, double my tiling. And of course, I can rotate my texture. So I can actually have it rotate to be the proper angle. Because again, when you work with certain assets like this wood grain, you want to make sure that it flows to a certain degree. Wood assets, typically the wood grain flows to the longest edge. And in this case, here to here is the longest edge, not going left to right. So now we probably just need one more thing, and that is we need wood color. So let's just go back into our material layer and set a multiply. Let's add a vector 3, and let's of course set him to white, because if you set it to white, it just leaves it already at the default color. Again, think when we work on parameters, we want to make sure that they're set to a nice default value and not to some crazy custom value first. So we plug this in here, plug this one in here, and plug it in. Now let's convert this to a parameter. We'll call this one our albedo tint. And let's hit save. Go back to our instance. And now we have ourselves a value here. And let's give it like a nice type of brown, like so. Maybe a little more desaturated, maybe a little bit more on the orange side, like that. Perfect. So as you can see, we have ourselves like a nice wood asset to work with. And what's cool is we can reuse this material layer asset that we just created. It has these basic parameters so far. So what I mean is when we go back into our instance, into our layer, we can go to the next level, which is our next layer. And of course, you get a new layer. We now have 2 slots instead of 1, and we now have a little name here. And so you can call this, again, whatever you want. I'll call this one metal, just to be simple. And if we open up our little arrow, we have a layer asset, and then we have a blend asset. So the layer asset, of course, can use one of these material layer assets. Again, like in this case, this environment base that we just already used, we can use that. But now for the blend assets, we need to actually create one. So let's go back into our materials folder, and I'm going to make a new asset. So let's go back to that little material layer section, and we need a material layer blend asset. So I type in MLB underscore, and of course, you know, when we mask this out, I want to probably set it to be like a certain type of like masking agent. In this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my mask ID texture that I have that I've already imported in, that I generated from Substance Painter. So we go back in here. Let me double click this guy, but let me just rename him. And I'll call this one, let's see, rename. I'll just call this one ID mask. So we have our ID mask assets, but if we open this up, you can see we actually have a couple more, nodes in here. Namely, we have an input bottom layer and a top input layer. Then we have a blend asset and then an output asset. Now, think of this blend asset as like a lerp node, or even like the blend node inside of Substance Designer, if you're more familiar with that. So what it's going to require is a black and white value, an alpha essentially, or a mask. So all it requires is just that. So you can use any sort of thing that generates a black and white input to use as a mask. In this case, if I go in here, go back to my textures, I have this mask based texture that I have. So I can use this. Let me just convert him into a parameter and call this my mask ID. And we now need to choose, because in this case, I'm going to have red, green, blue, and alpha, because in this case, my mask, when I generate it, does have an alpha input. So what we want is, let's go in here and we need a parameter, because I want to be able to control where the mask input is used. There is one we can use called the channel mask parameter, or there is I know it's around here, mask selector. Channel mask parameter. Yeah, that's right. So we have this one. So if we plug this in, we don't want the RGB, we want the RGBA, because again, we want the red, green, blue, and alpha channels as well. We plug this in, and this parameter, we'll call this one our mask channel. And of course, by default, it's always going to be either red, green, blue, or alpha. And then let's plug this in. So how this works is, it's going to choose a mask. Again, whatever's white in the mask will show what's in the B slot, because that's how typical lerps are inside of Unreal Engine. So the B slot is looking for white values for the mask. The A slot, this one right here, is going to look for the black values. Now this bottom layer and top layer, it's relative. So it's relative to what layer it's currently on. So if we go back to our little Colt, this layer, the metal layer, is our top layer, because that's the current layer that we're currently in. The bottom layer is anything else that's below it. So it could be this guy, or it could be all of the other layers once we have like a bunch of them in the stack, essentially. So if I grab this MLB mask, hit save, and let's go in here. I can grab my MLB ID mask. And as you can see, I have a couple parameters. I have a mask ID right here, and I have a mask channel right here. So let's double check this, and let's add in my mask texture. So I have my Colt mask. It's not this one. Type in ID. Here it is, Colt ID. So as you can see, I have it only selecting now certain areas of the wood, but I probably want to change it so it's not the red channel, but maybe the green channel, because that's where most of my other assets are. So let's go to the green channel. And now you can see this white asset that doesn't have any sort of textures applied to it right now is still white. So let's just hit save so we can see so far. Boom. Now it's masking just this area. So let's go back in and let's add in some new textures. In this case, I have some metal. So we have metal gun. Let me grab my albedo. Let's grab my normal map, and let's grab my ORM. And as you can see, boom. So again, we got to do some tiling, so we can use the same parameters that we had already set up before. So maybe we can tile it 3 times or 4 times in this case. You can control as much as you want. You can also go with adjusting the rotation, or now we can adjust the tint. Maybe you want like a brass gun or something. You can do that. If you want more kind of silver, silver has kind of like a more kind of bluish type of tint to it. You can do so as well. And of course, there's so many other things that we can go about with this workflow. So one of the next things is, of course, because you can change, again, how many parameters you want. We can adjust things like roughness, and of course, more albedo tinting stuff. Like we go in here, I can go and do a multiply and a simple scalar. And this will be my roughness adjustment. So I grab my roughness value, plug him in like so, and I can plug him in here. So maybe if I want him to be, shinier, I can do so as well. Or if I want him rougher, I can do so as well too. If maybe the normal map is a little too intense, we can go back into the adjustment here. So not just with the roughness, but there's also another node we can use called flatten normal, as you can see. So if I plug this in, normal map, and I add another value, actually I need 2. So because how flatten normal works is the input that you bring in, it's going to look for, if it's set to 0, like it essentially says, this is not a flat normal map. But when you set it to 1, it flattens the normal map out where there's no bumps, scratches, or anything. Now, I don't like it like that because I don't like the fact that I'm flattening my normal map, or I'm adjusting my normal intensity going up by making the details go down, like lowering them, flattening them. So what I like to do is I like to grab a scalar and I like to grab a 1 minus node. Now this 1 minus node, if I just, select this, plug this guy in like so, what's going to happen now is if I set him to 1, he inverts himself and makes him black because it's 1 minus X. And in this case, the X is going to be whatever value you put in there. So 1 minus 1 is 0. So that's why it inverts it essentially. So if I convert this guy into a normal intensity input, I can plug him into my normal map like so. And again, the normal intensity is a little too strong. I can start to flatten him out a little bit until he's not as bumpy. And of course I can adjust the roughness just a little bit until it's like nice and smooth and clean. And then of course, if the albedo is a little weird, then I can just adjust little things here too. So that's one thing that we can go further along with this stuff. So now let's go into the wear and tear category of things. So just as I've already made a mask input, I also have that other mask that we generated, this guy right here. So if we open them up, you'll see if I start to grab some of these guys, you'll see that this is where my discoloration is. So I can actually choose to discolor or dirty some areas. I can add damage to some other areas. And of course I can add other little bits of roughness variation on top. There's also other little bits of splotching, other adjustments. I can do so as well here. So we can actually use this mask for anything we want essentially. So where this damage, dirt, and all that other stuff kind of comes into play is essentially it's a secondary section that we're going to have inside of the actual material layer. So all the damage, dirt, all that stuff is going to be toggleable within the layer that we're using. So the wood can have its own, the metal can have its own, any other little bit will have its own. It's not going to be specific just to the whole weapon. It's going to be for each one of these guys. So we go back in here, and of course I have my standard inputs all like so. So let's go in here and let's grab my little mask. So if we go back in, and in this case, I'll grab my other little mask texture, my Colt one. And I have him all set up. I can go and grab a lerp node and say, hey, for this case, we're going to have it so that when he goes into here, there's going to be another color value that's being adjusted essentially. So we'll have a wear, a dirt or a damage version of that mask essentially. So if I go in here, I'll call this one my dirt color tint. Or it doesn't have to be dirt. It could just be dirtiness. It doesn't actually have to be dirt itself. So I just plug all this in like so. Plug it in here so I can just tint the same value, because typically you want to keep a color similar to the base texture that's applied. And then of course we plug them in and plug them into the base color. So let's go back to our layer. And as you can see, we have a little bit of this discoloration. So this is just general kind of color variation wear. So if I go in, I can go into our instance, go to that little dirt color and give it, let's give it a crazy color so you can kind of see where some spots are essentially. Oh, sorry, that's the metal. Go back down to the base layer. So as you can see, when I start to do this, you can see I have some little bits of color variation. So I can add a nice darker spot or dirtier spot, or I can color select something like this, just to add a little bit of variation. Now, this is just for one aspect. So this is just a little bit of dirt and damage. Then we can go in and add in another layer, as in another lerp. So we can add in another lerp, plug this guy in, and this is going to be where the actual chipping and damage is when it comes to wood. Now, I'll grab my green channel and I'll plug him in here. And I'll again add in a multiply. And boom. So again, each one of these guys is going to have a different aspect of how things get discolored when they're damaged. So like when wood gets chipped, say the edges get chipped or they're weared down, basically, you start to reveal the bare wood that's not color tinted or color stained on top. So typically like woods has like a little bit of a nice light yellow or a nice light red. It just depends on the type of bare wood that's underneath it. So start off with this, plug that in, and I'll plug in the base color. And I'm trying to just separate these guys just a little bit. So this is my damage color tint. Because the same is also going to be for the metal. So when the metal gets damaged, when it gets scratched, it gets to like that bare color metal, which is usually like a typically white or lighter color. It's like cutting away all the dirt and stuff that's underneath it. So go right here. I go to my damage color. I can, make it seem more yellow in some areas because it's going to be starting to wear and tear and chipping under, like right here, basically. So you can control it too. You can, of course, adjust little bits of layers. You can add clamps to it. So you can adjust the mask. You can make it more contrasted. There's so many different things to it. But what this does is it allows you to have a little bit more color adjustment, but also you can do roughness adjustments as well. So you can make these things more dirtier if you want to, using the same exact mask that we have generated. So we go back in here. We can grab another multiply. Actually, sorry. Yeah, another multiply. And then we'll grab a lerp. Plug them in here. And we'll grab where that roughness adjustment is. And we'll grab this multiply. And again, I'll take the same roughness input and grab another one of these scalars. And this will be damage roughness adjustment. Give him a base value. And then plug him into the roughness like so. So if we want to, if we go back to our little colt and we'll grab some adjustments here and there. So if I want to make the roughness a little bit rougher, I can do so as well in just certain areas. So you can control all of this stuff to give just little bits of variation to your surface as you see fit, essentially. So another thing also is, as you can start to see that my material layer is going to start to get a little more complex. We're starting to get that spaghetti-ification, essentially, of our surface. So if we want to make things a little bit more optimized, what we could do is we can actually add in what are called reroute nodes. So reroute nodes were something that was introduced in like a later version of Unreal Engine 4. I think it's like 4.25. But reroute nodes are these guys. So you can grab here, you can reroute or like make it so that the wires don't crisscross as much, but you can actually convert this guy into a named reroute node. So I can call this guy my dirt mask. And I can give it a little color, make him kind of brownish like so. And then I can have my reroute node. And of course I can rename this guy too, convert to a named reroute, and I'll call this one my damage mask. So what's cool about this is, think of these guys like they're Ethernet cables in your house. You probably don't want to have like 100-foot Ethernet cable running through your house like all willy-nilly. It's kind of gets a little messy. So what we can do is these guys act almost like Wi-Fi. So that if I grab a reroute node here, I can just leave them as they are, but then I can find where the wires connect, like up here, and I can grab a reroute node just like the ones here, and I can grab my dirt one because this is for my dirt color tint mask. And I can do the same thing for my damage one too. So I can go here, grab my damage one. So instead of having the wires all crisscross like this, I can have them be very kind of isolated in the sense that I can select all these guys and move them just a little bit further away so they're, not all crisscrossing as much. I can do the same thing here for the same reroute node. So here's my damage mask, and boom, makes it so much easier to manage this stuff. You can also do the same thing with your texture inputs. So say you want to like only have like these guys apply for certain texture inputs, you can do so as well too. So like right here is where my roughness one is. So I can add in a reroute node and I can convert him to my roughness output. Let's put input. So let's do output. And then of course my roughness output could be right here. Plug them in like so. So now you can just kind of have these guys all the way down here and in their own section, basically. So that helps out a lot. So you can have your masks all here isolated on their own. And you can also have your different things like your roughness. You can make a frame for him or a comment essentially. And just call this one my roughness section. So you can organize this stuff a lot more efficiently too. So whatever you can do to, one, make it easy to organize for yourself, but also for your team members, that's really going to be the big key thing as we kind of move forward with this. So let's hit save. And let's just add one more thing in here just so that I have a little bit of functionality before we go into our last layer blend, essentially. And that is how to toggle on and off those bits of wear and tear, because maybe we don't need dirt or damage or anything like that. We can turn some of that stuff off if we want to. So one way is right here where the material is at its base. And then we have all this wear and tear and stuff on top. So we can add what's called a switch node or a static switch parameter. What this does is it creates a toggle. That toggle will say if something is true, it toggles it on. So when this is checked right here in this little parameter, it toggles it on to make it true. So whatever's true gets shown here. So in this case, if I want to just leave this guy as in nowhere and uses wear, I can say toggle wear. And then once we go down here, we can hit save. Now, of course, that's not the only one. We want to use the same parameter here, because if you copy and paste the parameter, you can use it to toggle multiple things at once. It makes it so much easier. So if we go back in to say where our roughness adjustment was, like so. So here's where our damage one is, and here's where our regular one is. If we just, make that a little bit bigger, plug them in and do the same thing. So we plug in our false to not have our wear and tear and damage and all that stuff. And then we have the one that actually does toggle it. We can plug that into our roughness output. And then we can hit save. And what's cool is when you do that, it actually hides all the parameters that you don't need anymore because they're not toggled on. So if we go back into our little static switch parameter, you can see toggle it to turn it on. And then right now I can toggle it to turn the wear on. And now you can see now the wear stuff starts to show up essentially. So this allows you to be able to toggle this stuff on and off if you need it or don't need it essentially. So now that we have our base layer blends, because you can keep using this and keep adding more functionality into it until the cows come home basically. And what's cool is you can use this stuff as functionally as it is. You can do more ones with metal, or you can do more ones with leather, or whatever else you want to add on top of this guy essentially. But the last one is our macro overlay that I had talked about. So the macro overlay essentially is where we can take a baked map like an ambient occlusion map or a roughness map, and we can actually toggle it to overlay on top of it. And I know we had talked earlier on in how to set up UVs and stuff inside of Maya. You can actually blend between different UV sets using this method, because sometimes we might have the first UV set for our baked UVs, but then the second UV set is for the tilables, for the actual tileable materials. So we can actually toggle that. So if we go in here, let's make a new material. So let's go back into our materials and let's make a new material layer asset. And I'll call this one ML for material layer. And this one will be called our macro material layer. So what this guy is going to use is another make material attribute. Plug him in, like so. And I just need my 2 inputs for my macro. So if we go back to our textures, I can grab a base and I can grab we'll grab my height texture. It's not actually for my height texture. It's just the fact that it's a linear grayscale texture. And my AO is also my linear grayscale texture. So if you want to, you can grab these guys, plug them in like so. So this one would be my macro. And then this one would be my ambient occlusion. So I can actually just grab the red channel instead and plug them in. Now, to toggle between which textures use the proper UV set, you can go in here to the texture coordinate node. And in this case, to adjust which is which, like which UV set you're using, is to adjust this value right here, the coordinate index. So you can grab, right now 0 is our base, but 1 is the second UV set. Starts off with the number 0. I know it can be a little complex, but the second UV set is coordinate index 1. So here we're using the first UV set, so we're just going to leave this as it is. But if we go back here, and in this case, if we have a secondary UV set that we're using for textile density sake, like say if, all of our tileables are reacting to using the second UV set UVs, you can go back in here, change the coordinate to the first UV set. So now we have 2 separate tileables using 2 separate UV sets essentially. So once we got that all situated, now let's go into the blend because we now made our material layer. Let's go in here and let's go back to our materials and let's make a new material layer blend asset. And this is our MLB macro overlay. So let's go in here and it's going to get a little complex because we're not actually going to be using a mask input for this. We're actually going to be just blending different values from the 2 different layers on top of each other, essentially. So remember how very early on I was talking about things like get and set for the material attribute values. So we're going to use those nodes right now. So I'm going to grab a get material attribute. And what this does is it goes from the single material input and it allows me to pull out specific texture inputs. In this case, I can grab my normal map and I can grab my ambient occlusion. There it is, ambient occlusion. So now I can grab these 2 guys and I can do the same thing here. So what this does is it takes the ambient occlusion and the normal map from each layer. So again, top layer is our most current layer. So in this case, this will be our macro layer. And then everything else here is all the normal blends from the layers below, essentially. And now what we're going to do is we're going to start to mix how each one of these guys blends. So ambient occlusion is the easiest. You just need to multiply. Just like how in Substance Painter, if you actually want to blend multiple ambient occlusion values, you just use a multiply. So you plug these guys in together like so, and that's it. So ambient occlusion is done. Now for normal maps, that's a little different. You actually have to use a blend angle corrected normals node. This is how you'll be able to blend all this stuff together. So if we take the normal of our macro and the normal of our tileable, it's going to blend them right on top. It doesn't matter where the UV sets are. Essentially, it's going to project where those normal texture details and stuff are going to be on the mesh all together and blend it all nicely. So we can take these results now. And of course, we can't plug it into this guy because we can't. So we need another node, and that is our set material attributes node. So now, just like a material, just like the get material attributes, the set material attributes does the same thing, but now we need to re-add those 2 slots, aka our normal map and our ambient occlusion, like so. So we'll now take the result of the blends for our normal here, and we'll take the result of our ambient occlusion here and plug them in. Now, the last thing is, well, what about the albedo, roughness, metallic, all that other stuff? Well, we don't need any of that from our macro layer because we only have those two textures. Well, there's this other little node on top called material attributes. Well, there's also another material attributes value here. So if you need the rest from the lower layer in this case, you can just grab the material attributes input here and it fills in the blanks. It fills in the albedo, it fills in the roughness, metallic, any other map essentially, and plugs it all in. And then finally, we can just delete this because we don't need that. We're not actually doing that lerp style blend. We're just blending them all together with simple inputs. And then let's just hit save. So with all that in mind, all we got to do now is go back into our cult and grab our macro. So we have our material layer for our macro, and we have our macro overlay blend. So now if we go in here, looks like our macro overlay. These guys were not set to parameters, so let's convert them to parameters. And I'll call this one my macro normal. Macro normal. And we'll call this one, oh, that's not the macro normal. That's my macro AO. So now let's hit save and let's go back to the cult and let's start to add in the textures. So now we type in macro. So we have our cult normal maps macro, and we have our macro texture like that. So now you can see they're added in here. You can see that they're overlaying on top, but it looks like we have a bit of an issue. So let me just do one little tweak. Ah, yes, there we go. Yeah, you're right. It's on that one. AO. Trust me, I'm a professional. Let's see, macro. Now let's hit save. Yeah, macro normal, macro AO. There we go. Now that's looking a lot better. So, like I was mentioned before, this macro layer assets is just, again, two different textures. And then the blend itself is just not actually lerp blending. It's just taking those two textures into account and blending them on top of each other, essentially. So we don't actually have to like mask out and blend. So it makes it so much easier for us to just kind of overlay the stuff if you just want to just simply have an extra null map or an extra ambient occlusion map blended on top. But besides that, that is mostly how you would handle material layering. Again, the last thing that I'm going to mention is that you probably have noticed that I have these other little assets right here, these little decals, essentially. These are just little flat geo decals or mesh decals that use parallax occlusion. The reason why I didn't put this inside of, say, like the normal map or any other value is because even if I export it out at a very high resolution, like say a 4K or something, they would be lowered in resolution and they'd be very blurry or messy, essentially. And you don't want that. You want to have like the best looking little bits of nuts and screws. And even in the case of right here by the barrel, I have these little bits of actual text and stuff. So this is just a simple material that has its own little values that I made inside of Substance Designer. And I just hand placed all these little bits of flat planes on top of this, essentially, to create the effect that we're going with. So they're just flatly on top. They're not like there's some special blend or anything. They're just simple mesh decals. And you want to do something like this because you can't really get away with like these small details, especially how small some of these guys are with a baked normal map. Even with that macro overlay of like the normal or AO, it just will not be efficient enough. So what we want to do is we want to try and use these guys to help add that secondary bit of detail on top of things just to make it so much better. But yes, this is essentially how you would do a material layer inside of Unreal Engine.
Hey everyone, Timothy Dries here, founder of Beyond Extend. Thank you so much for being a part of our workshop host program and for being such an amazing host and sharing all these wonderful workflow tips with all of us so that we can take our own layer material setups to the next level. If you want to learn more about like how to start with your next environment, please go and check out this other video that we did on that topic recently. And also, if you want to take your environment art skills to the next level, we have a lot of exclusive content such as weekly work reviews, monthly portfolio reviews, and of course, our big environment artist handbook, just to name a few of the things that we offer. All available to you if you become a community member. So stay creative, and I hope to see you there.